Ambassador Vextherin had attended diplomatic functions across 17 stellar systems, had broken bread with species that breathed methane and others that photosynthesized. But nothing had prepared him for the casual horror of a human dinner party. The invitation had seemed innocent enough, a cultural exchange meant to foster understanding between the Galactic Council and humanity's newest representatives. He had expected something simple, perhaps the processed nutrient blocks that most civilized species consumed, or maybe one of those laboratory-grown protein matrices that had become fashionable among the younger worlds. What he witnessed instead would haunt him for the remainder of his considerably long life. The humans had served what they called surf and turf, and as the plates arrived at the crystalline table, Vextherin's translator struggled to process the casual conversation happening around him. "I had them flown in fresh from the coast," the human host, a woman named Catherine, said with evident pride. "The lobsters were still moving this morning." She said this as though it were a point of quality rather than an admission of barbarism. Vextherin watched in mounting disbelief as his human colleagues cracked open the armored exoskeleton of what his neural implant identified as a Terran crustacean, an apex predator of Earth's ancient oceans, a creature that had survived virtually unchanged for millions of years. They tore into its flesh with small metal instruments designed specifically for this purpose, tools crafted for the dismemberment of once living beings. The casual efficiency of it made his respiratory slits flutter with anxiety. But it was the other portion of the meal that truly stopped his hearts. The cut of meat beside the crustacean, marbled with fat and seared to mathematical precision, came from what humans call the cow, though Vextherin's database painted a different picture entirely. These massive beasts, easily capable of trampling a human to death, were raised in vast numbers for the sole purpose of consumption. Across the table, Ambassador Chen from the Terran Coalition lifted his glass of fermented plant extract, another peculiar human vice, and noticed Vextherin's pale complexion. "Not to your taste, Ambassador? I apologize, we should have asked about dietary restrictions." The genuine concern in his voice somehow made it worse, as though the issue were one of preference rather than profound philosophical crisis. Vextherin managed a weak gesture of politeness, his translator producing something approximating gratitude, but his mind reeled. In all his years of diplomatic service, he had encountered species that hunted, certainly, but they did so out of necessity, in balanced ecosystems where predator and prey maintained ancient equilibriums. The humans did something entirely different. They had industrialized the consumption of apex predators, had turned the hunting of the most dangerous creatures on their planet into a casual Tuesday evening activity. "Actually," Catherine continued, either oblivious to or ignoring his discomfort, "next month we're planning a hunting trip. Wild boar in the highlands. You're welcome to join us, Ambassador. It's quite the experience." Wild boar. His implant helpfully provided imagery of the creature in question, a massive, tusked beast known for its aggressive temperament and surprising intelligence. Humans hunted these animals for sport and sustenance, tracking them through difficult terrain, facing their charges armed with primitive projectile weapons. They did this voluntarily. For enjoyment. The revelation struck Vextherin with the force of a gravitational anomaly. He had reviewed the files on humanity before accepting this assignment, had studied their history, their wars, their rapid technological advancement. He had noted with academic interest that they were a death world species, hailing from a planet with gravity that would crush most council members, with weather patterns that shifted from lethal heat to deadly cold, with an atmosphere so corrosive with oxygen that it would poison most known life forms. But somehow, he had failed to connect these facts to the reality sitting before him on a porcelain plate. The dinner conversation flowed around him like a river around stone, and Vextherin found himself listening with a mixture of fascination and dread. The humans spoke of their meal with genuine appreciation, discussing the terroir of the lobster's home waters, the quality of the marbling in the beef, the skill required to prepare such ingredients properly. They had elevated the consumption of apex predators to an art form, had created entire philosophical frameworks around the proper way to kill and consume the most dangerous creatures the world had to offer. "My grandfather used to take me fishing for shark when I was just a boy," one of the human diplomats, a man named James, said with evident nostalgia. "Mako shark, mostly. Beautiful creatures, fast as anything in the ocean. We'd catch them, clean them right there on the boat, and have steaks for dinner. Best meals of my childhood. Shark." Vex Theron's database erupted with warnings about the creature in question: apex oceanic predator, multiple rows of serrated teeth, capable of detecting electromagnetic fields, responsible for thousands of years of human mythology and fear. And this human had hunted them as a child, as a recreational bonding activity with his elder. Catherine laughed at the memory, sharing her own tale of hunting alligator in the swamps of her youth, wrestling with ancient reptilian predators in environments that would kill most galactic species through disease alone, never mind the fauna. The other humans nodded along, sharing their own stories of consumption and conquest, a greatest hits compilation of humanity's casual relationship with their planet's most dangerous inhabitants. Vex Theron realized with growing certainty that he was not merely observing a cultural quirk but witnessing something fundamental about human nature. These beings had not just survived on their death world, they had thrived by systematically consuming everything above them on the food chain. They had looked at creatures designed by evolution to be unkillable and decided they looked delicious. The ecological audacity of it was staggering. Most species that reached sapience did so by avoiding predation, by using intelligence to hide, to flee, to build safe havens away from the creatures that would eat them. Humans had done the opposite. They had used their intelligence to become better predators than the predators, to develop tools and strategies that let them hunt animals that should, by any reasonable metric, have hunted them to extinction. "You know what I miss most about Earth?" another diplomat, Maria, chimed in. "Fresh tuna. There's a place in Tokyo where they serve it so fresh it's still twitching on the plate. Bluefin caught that morning from deep water. Nothing in the galaxy compares to that." She said this wistfully, as though describing a lost love rather than the consumption of an animal that her own species had nearly driven to extinction through overhunting, only to then implement complex international regulations to ensure they could continue eating it sustainably. The contradiction didn't seem to trouble her in the slightest. Vex Theron's third stomach churned as he processed the implications. Humanity hadn't just conquered their world's apex predators, they had nearly consumed them into oblivion, then stepped back at the last moment, not out of mercy but out of long-term strategic planning. They wanted to ensure they could keep eating these creatures indefinitely. They had industrialized predation to such a degree that they needed to manage prey populations to prevent their own success from eliminating their favorite foods. The revelation that would truly shake the Galactic Council came later in the evening, during what the humans called dessert, another meal consumed after the first meal had concluded, because apparently humans ate multiple elaborate preparations in a single sitting. Catherine brought out what she called a cheese board, and Vex Theron's horror reached new dimensions as she casually explained the process of cheese creation. Humans took the lactation fluids meant to nourish the young of other species, introduced bacteria, and allowed the mixture to ferment, sometimes for years, until it transformed into something they considered a delicacy. They had weaponized spoilage itself, had turned decomposition into cuisine. "This one," Catherine said, pointing to a particularly pungent specimen, "is made from sheep's milk and aged in caves for 18 months. The bacteria that gives it that distinctive flavor was discovered completely by accident in the 14th century. She spoke with the reverence others might reserve for religious artifacts, describing mold and bacterial contamination as though they were precious gifts. But it was James who delivered the statement that would change everything, the casual comment that would reshape how every species in the galaxy understood humanity's place in the cosmic order. "Of course," he said, spreading the aged, bacteria-riddled sheep lactation product onto a piece of grain that had been ground, mixed with water, exposed to fungal spores, and heated until it solidified. "Nothing compares to a good bear roast. My uncle bags one every autumn. The meat's rich, gamey." You have to cook it properly because of the parasites, but when it's done right, there's nothing quite like it. Bear. The word hung in the air like a singularity, bending the conversation around it. Vextherin accessed his database with trembling appendages, certain he must have misunderstood, but no, there it was. Bears. Massive omnivorous predators, some species weighing over 600 kilograms, equipped with claws capable of decapitating a human with a single swipe, possessing bite forces that could crush bone, territorial and aggressive, responsible for countless human deaths throughout history. And humans hunted them, ate them, had favorite recipes. You consume bears? Vextherin heard himself ask, his translator probably mangling the inflection, but he no longer cared about diplomatic niceties. The humans looked at him with mild surprise, as though he had asked whether they consumed water or breathed air. Well, yes, Catherine replied. Black bear mostly, though grizzly is popular in some regions. There are regulations, of course, hunting seasons and license requirements, but it's a fairly common practice in rural areas. Why do you ask? Why did he ask? Why did he ask? Vextherin felt something shifting in his understanding of the universe, tectonic plates of perception grinding against each other to form new mountains of comprehension. He had assumed, as had everyone in the Galactic Council, that humanity's rapid technological advancement, their startling success in recent conflicts, their unusual resilience in the face of setbacks, were products of their intelligence, their social structures, perhaps their unusual brain chemistry. And those factors certainly played a role, but he was beginning to understand that something deeper was at work, something that had been staring them all in the face but had been too alien to recognize. Humans had spent their entire evolutionary history consuming apex predators. Not occasionally, not in desperate times, but as a regular, celebrated part of their existence. They had looked at the most dangerous creatures their planet could produce and asked not, "How do we avoid these?" but rather, "How should we season these?" The psychological implications were staggering. While other species developed fear responses to predators, instincts that told them to flee, to hide, to avoid confrontation at all costs, humans had developed something else entirely. They had developed an instinct to hunt, to pursue, to view danger not as a warning but as a challenge. More than that, they had eroticized the consumption of deadly creatures, had made it a cornerstone of their social bonding, their cultural identity, their very sense of what it meant to be human. The dinner conversation continued, but Vextherin barely heard it, lost in cascading realizations. Humanity's military doctrines, which other species found needlessly aggressive, made perfect sense when you understood that these were beings who hunted bears for food. Their negotiation tactics, which often involved the willingness to accept casualties that would be unthinkable to other species, were the natural extension of a culture that considered wrestling alligators a childhood rite of passage. When Vextherin returned to his quarters that evening, he immediately drafted a classified report to the Galactic Council, marking it with the highest priority flags available to his station. The other ambassadors needed to understand what he had witnessed, needed to recalibrate their entire approach to human relations in light of this revelation. He began with the facts, describing the dinner in clinical detail, listing the species humans consumed as casually as his own people consumed synthesized nutrients. Lobster, those armored survivors of Earth's ancient seas. Cattle, massive herd beasts that could easily kill an unarmed human. Pigs and boars, intelligent omnivores with aggressive temperaments. Sharks, the ocean's most efficient predators. Alligators and crocodiles, living fossils that had survived multiple extinction events. Bear, massive territorial predators. And those were just the examples mentioned in casual dinner conversation. His research revealed dozens more, hundreds more, a comprehensive catalog of death that humanity had systematically worked its way through. They ate deer, graceful herbivores capable of goring attackers with their antlers. They ate bison, the massive bovines that had once dominated their plains in herds millions strong. They ate rabbit and squirrel, consuming even the smallest creatures that moved. They ate octopus, beings of startling intelligence that could solve puzzles and recognize individuals. They ate fish of every description, from the smallest to the largest, from the depths of the ocean to the heights of mountain streams. They had even, in their more distant past, hunted and consumed the largest land animals their planet had ever produced, driving some to extinction in their insatiable appetite. But it went deeper than mere consumption, Vex Theron realized as his research continued into the early hours of the morning. Humans had built their entire civilization around the conquest and consumption of other species. Their agricultural revolution, the foundation of their society, had begun with the domestication of wolves, apex predators that humans had somehow convinced to join them, and the systematic breeding of wild cattle and pigs for easier consumption. They had looked at animals that could kill them and decided to turn them into livestock, into property, into food production units. Their cities were built on the bones of the animals they had displaced. Their economies ran on industries dedicated to the killing, processing, and distribution of once-living creatures. Their celebrations and holidays almost universally involved the ritualistic consumption of elaborately prepared predators and prey alike. Even their language was infected with it, casual phrases that revealed the depth of their predatory nature. They brought home the bacon, referring to successful hunts. They celebrated victories with beef and beer. They described easy tasks as shooting fish in a barrel, apparently a real activity they had invented to make hunting even more efficient. The psychological profile that emerged from this analysis was unlike anything in the Galactic Council's extensive xenological databases. Humans were persistence hunters, a rare and terrifying evolutionary strategy that involved simply refusing to give up. They couldn't outrun most prey, couldn't overpower most predators in direct combat, but they could keep going long after any sensible creature would have quit. They would track wounded animals for days, following blood trails across continents if necessary, never stopping, never resting, until their target collapsed from exhaustion. This same persistence showed up in every aspect of their culture. Human scientists who faced decades of failure before achieving breakthroughs. Human artists who produced thousands of works before finding success. Human soldiers who fought on despite injuries that would incapacitate any other species. They were a civilization of beings who simply did not understand the concept of giving up, and it all traced back to their fundamental relationship with food. They had spent millions of years learning that persistence paid off, that the creature that seemed impossible to catch would eventually tire, that the predator that seemed unstoppable could be outlasted. And then they had applied that lesson to everything else in their existence. Vex Theron found himself reviewing humanity's recent conflicts with new understanding. The war with the Kresh Dominion, where humanity had been outgunned, outmaneuvered, and ridden off as defeated, only to keep fighting until the Kresh, exhausted and overextended, had sued for peace. The trade negotiations with the merchant guilds, where humanity had accepted terms that seemed disadvantageous, then slowly, persistently, turned every concession into an advantage. The terraforming of hostile worlds that other species had deemed impossible, where humans had simply kept trying, kept adapting, kept pushing until the impossible became routine. The response from the Galactic Council arrived 3 days later, and it was not what Vex Theron had expected. Rather than alarm or concern, the dominant emotion seemed to be skepticism. Several council members questioned whether he had misunderstood human culture, whether perhaps the consumption of apex predators was limited to some fringe group rather than mainstream society. Others suggested he was overreacting, that dietary habits were hardly a reliable predictor of diplomatic or military behavior. Ambassador Kelthrin of the Harmonious Collective was particularly dismissive, noting that his own species consumed various creatures and this had not made them particularly aggressive or dangerous. Vex Theron wanted to scream at the screens, to shake his fellow diplomats until they understood the fundamental difference, but he restrained himself, barely, and composed a detailed response. The issue was not merely that humans consumed other species, many omnivorous and carnivorous species did that, but rather the specific nature of what they consumed and how they had structured their entire civilization around it. The Harmonious Collective, he noted, consumed small insects and aquatic filter feeders, creatures that posed no threat and required no courage to obtain. Humans consumed creatures that fought back, that could and did kill humans regularly, and they did so not out of necessity but out of preference. He attached anthropological studies, footage from human documentaries that showed their hunting shows, entertainment programs where humans traveled to remote locations specifically to track and kill dangerous animals. He included economic data showing the vast scale of their food industries, the billions of formerly dangerous creatures raised and slaughtered annually to feed humanity's appetites. He provided linguistic analysis showing how deeply predation was embedded in human thought patterns, how they described business competition as dog eat dog, how they advised each other to go for the throat, or circle the wagons, or never show fear. But perhaps most damning, he included historical records from humanity's own archives, their proud documentation of what they called megafauna extinction events. Wherever humans had migrated throughout their planet's history, the largest, most dangerous animals had vanished within a few thousand years. Massive ground sloths that stood taller than houses, cave bears that dwarfed their modern descendants, dire wolves and saber-toothed cats and short-faced bears that made contemporary predators look domesticated by comparison. Humanity had eaten them all into extinction, then developed technologies to resurrect them for further study and potential future consumption. The second response from the Council was different in tone, more measured, more concerned. An emergency session was called, and Vextheron found himself presenting his findings to the full assembly, standing before representatives of 47 stellar nations and explaining why the eating habits of one small death world species should concern them all. He spoke of ecological dominance, of how humanity had achieved complete supremacy over their planet not through size or strength or natural weapons, but through intelligence, cooperation, and an absolute refusal to accept their place in the food chain. He explained how this same drive had manifested in their approach to space exploration, how they had looked at the vast, hostile emptiness between stars and seen not a barrier but a new hunting ground. He described their reaction to first contact with the Galactic Council, how other species had responded with awe or fear or careful diplomacy, while humans had immediately begun calculating how to achieve strategic parity with civilizations thousands of years older than their own. And he posed the question that he knew was on everyone's minds but that no one wanted to voice. If humans had spent their entire evolutionary history consuming apex predators, what would they do if they ever decided the galaxy's other civilizations looked appetizing? The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft hum of translation matrices working overtime to convey the weight of his words into dozens of languages and sensory formats. Finally, Ambassador Cuthrin spoke, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine curiosity. "What do you propose, Ambassador Vextheron? Humanity is already a member of the Council. We cannot simply uninvite them because we find their dietary habits disturbing." Vextheron had anticipated this question and had spent days formulating his response. "I propose we stop treating humanity as a slightly odd member of the galactic community, and start treating them as what they truly are, the most successful predator species to ever achieve spaceflight. This doesn't mean we should fear them or attempt to contain them, quite the opposite. We should embrace their unique perspective, learn from their persistence, their adaptability, their absolute refusal to accept defeat." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But we should also never, ever forget what they are. These are beings who look at danger and see dinner, who respond to existential threats with menu planning. If we ever find ourselves in true crisis, facing some threat that seems insurmountable, humanity will be our greatest asset because they have spent millions of years learning how to kill and eat the unkillable." The council adjourned without reaching a formal conclusion, but Vextheron knew his message had been received. In the days and weeks that followed, he noticed subtle changes in how other species interacted with human diplomats, a new wariness mixed with a grudging respect, an acknowledgement that beneath the friendly smiles and diplomatic protocols lurked something far more primal and dangerous. As for Vextheron himself, he accepted Catherine's invitation to the hunting trip, not because he had any desire to shoot a wild boar, but because he understood now that to truly know humanity, one had to witness them in their element, pursuing danger with enthusiasm and skill. On a crisp autumn morning in the Scottish Highlands, he watched Ambassador Chin track a massive boar through dense undergrowth, saw the focus in his eyes, the calculated patience, the absolute certainty that this apex predator would eventually become dinner. And as the shout rang out and the boar fell, Vex Theron finally understood the truth that would shape galactic politics for generations to come. Humanity had not left their death world behind when they reached for the stars, they had brought it with them, carrying in their hearts and minds and cultural memory the knowledge that nothing in the universe was too dangerous to hunt, too powerful to challenge, too apex to devour. The galaxy had welcomed humanity as equals, but standing there in the highland mist, watching humans field dress a creature that outweighed them by hundreds of pounds, Vex Theron realized the truth. Humanity had never wanted to be equals, they had simply been polite enough not to mention that they were already planning the menu for when the rest of the galaxy learned what it meant to be prey.